Serpukhov 15 bunker, outside Moscow, September 26, 1983, 0:14 a.m. You are reading this sentence because of a decision one man made in the dark, in a bunker outside Moscow, in less than 8 minutes, at midnight, in 1983. He was not a general. He was not a president. He was not a hero by any conventional definition of the word. He was a 44-year-old Soviet lieutenant colonel filling in for a colleague who had called in sick. It was not supposed to be his shift. He had not planned to be there. At 0:14 a.m., a red light on the console in front of him lit up. The word that appeared on the screen was not a question. It was not an alert. It was not a warning. It was one single word, in capital letters: launch. The system was telling him that the United States had fired a nuclear missile at the Soviet Union. His orders, the doctrine that every officer at that console was trained to follow without hesitation, were to immediately report the launch up the chain of command. His superiors would then decide whether to authorize a retaliatory strike, and the Soviet Union in 1983 had thousands of nuclear warheads ready to fly within minutes. He had roughly 8 minutes to decide whether to follow those orders. If he was wrong in one direction, he would be responsible for not reporting a genuine nuclear attack. If he was wrong in the other direction, he would be responsible for triggering the Third World War. His name was Stanislav Petrov, and almost nobody knew his name until 15 years after it happened. The world. In the fall of 1983. To understand what Stanislav Petrov was facing that night, you have to understand what the world looked like in the fall of 1983, because it was not a normal period of Cold War tension. It was something considerably more dangerous than that. In March of that year, President Ronald Reagan had delivered his now famous Evil Empire speech, openly describing the Soviet Union as a moral adversary to be defeated, not negotiated with. That same month, he announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a proposed system of space-based weapons that could shoot down Soviet missiles before they reached American soil. From Moscow, this looked like preparation for a first strike. If the Americans could neutralize the Soviet ability to retaliate, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the grim guarantee that both sides would be destroyed in any nuclear exchange, which had kept the peace for decades, would no longer protect the USSR. The Soviets began to genuinely believe that a preemptive American nuclear attack was not just possible, but increasingly likely. Then, 3 weeks before Petrov's shift, on September 1st, 1983, a Soviet jet fighter shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 over Soviet airspace. All 269 people on board were killed, including a United States congressman. The international reaction was explosive. Reagan called it a crime against humanity. The United States and its NATO allies condemned the Soviet Union in the strongest possible terms. The Soviets, in turn, felt surrounded, cornered, misunderstood, and increasingly certain that Washington was building towards something. The KGB had launched a special intelligence operation called Operation Ryan, a standing order to all Soviet intelligence assets worldwide to watch for any signs of American preparation for a nuclear first strike. Agents were watching NATO military bases, American political schedules, even the lights in the Pentagon at night. The Soviets were looking for the first sign of what they were convinced was coming. Into this environment, this hair-trigger, paranoid, deeply unstable strategic moment in the history of human civilization, one man sat down for a night shift in a bunker outside Moscow, and the most dangerous machine ever built told him the war had started. The 8 minutes. Stanislav Petrov had not planned to be there that night. The officer who was supposed to be on duty had called in sick. Petrov was filling in. He had done this before. It was not unusual. He sat down at the console of the Serpukhov 15 Command Center, the nerve center of the Soviet Union's OKO satellite early warning network, a system of satellites monitoring American missile launch sites around the clock, and began his shift. A few hours passed quietly. Then, at 0:14 a.m. Moscow time, the alarm screamed. The console lit up. The word launch appeared in red. The computer indicated high reliability. One American intercontinental ballistic missile, inbound, targeting the Soviet Union, launched from Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. The bunker exploded into controlled panic. Officers around Petrov were shouting. The protocol was clear. Report immediately. Every minute of delay was a minute less for Soviet leadership to authorize a retaliatory strike before American missiles arrived. Time was everything. Petrov picked up the phone to his superiors, and then he put it back down. Something did not add up. Several things, in fact. First, Petrov had been trained extensively in American nuclear doctrine. He knew that a genuine U.S. first strike would not involve one missile. It would involve hundreds, a simultaneous, overwhelming assault designed to destroy Soviet launch capacity before the USSR could retaliate. One missile made no strategic sense whatsoever. Why announce yourself? Why give the Soviet Union time to fire back? Second, the OKO satellite system was new. Petrov had worked on its development. He knew its limitations better than almost anyone in that bunker. He knew it had been rushed into service before it was fully tested. He had described it privately as raw. He did not completely trust it. Third, ground-based radar, the secondary confirmation system, had detected nothing. No heat blooms, no corroborating signatures, just the satellite report, unconfirmed by any other system. Petrov later said, "When people start a war, they don't start it with only 5 missiles." Because as he was thinking through these factors, seconds passing, the shouting continuing around him, the phone in his hand, the console lit up again. 4 more missiles, all inbound, all targeting the USSR. The system now showed 5 American ICBMs in the air, all heading towards Soviet territory, with a reliability rating the computer described as highest. The officers around him were more urgent than ever. Report. Report now. Follow protocol. Petrov held the phone, and he thought. He knew that if he reported this upward, his superiors would receive the information in a context of maximum fear and tension. He knew what the doctrine said to do. He knew that the people above him in the chain of command would likely act on his report, rapidly, irrevocably, and he still did not think 5 missiles made any sense. He classified the alert as a false alarm. He did not report it. He waited. The 8 minutes passed. The 9 minutes. The 10. No missiles arrived. No explosions. No impact. No confirmation from any ground-based radar anywhere in the Soviet Union that anything had been launched at all. At some point in those interminable minutes, Stanislav Petrov understood that he had been right. The war had not started. The machines had been wrong. He had been right. And he had just made the most consequential decision in the history of the Cold War without anyone's permission and without any certainty that he was making the correct call. Later, investigators determined the cause of the false alarm, a rare and previously uncatalogued alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, which the OKO satellite sensors had misidentified as the exhaust signature of ballistic missiles launching from American soil. An error in the software that was supposed to filter out such anomalies had allowed the false signal to pass through all 30 layers of verification that the system was supposed to provide. 30 layers of verification, all of them fooled by sunlight on clouds. One man, in 8 minutes, caught what 30 layers of automated verification missed. What happened next? The cover-up. Nobody asked for. In the days immediately following the incident, Petrov was questioned intensively by a special military commission. The questioning lasted days. He did not sleep. His son Dmitry, who was 12 years old at the time, remembered his father coming home from those sessions completely hollowed out. Petrov said nothing to his family about what had happened. The incident was classified at the highest level. His wife of 10 years, the woman he loved and would later spend years caring for as she battled cancer, did not know about it for a decade. When she finally asked him, years later, "So what did you do?" he said, "Nothing. I did nothing." That was the most honest possible answer. He had chosen not to act. In a system built on instant action, on protocol, on the doctrine that the machine is correct and the human follows orders, he had chosen to wait, to think, to doubt. The commission's initial response was cautiously positive. General Yuri Votintsev, the first senior officer to hear Petrov's account, said his actions were correct and that he had been duly noted. A reward was mentioned, promised. It never came, because rewarding Petrov would mean acknowledging that the OKO system, the multi-billion ruble crown jewel of Soviet nuclear defense, designed and built by some of the most influential scientists and engineers in the USSR, had nearly triggered a global nuclear war because of a software error it was specifically built to prevent. To honor Petrov was to humiliate the system. To humiliate the system was to humiliate the people responsible for it. And in the Soviet military, that was not how things worked. Instead, Petrov was quietly reprimanded. For what? For failing to properly fill out his military diary during the incident. He had had a phone in one hand and an intercom in the other. He had been managing the most catastrophic potential military event in Soviet history, and they reprimanded him for paperwork. When an investigator asked why he hadn't documented every detail, Petrov responded, "Because I had a phone in one hand and the intercom in the other, and I don't have a third hand." He was reassigned to a less sensitive post. He retired early from the military, and then he had a nervous breakdown. Able Archer, the month that kept getting worse. The story does not end with September 26th, 11 days after Petrov's shift. On October 7, 1983, NATO launched a military exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to simulate a full-scale NATO response to a hypothetical Soviet nuclear attack, testing command and control procedures for NATO's nuclear forces. This was not unusual. NATO ran exercises regularly. But Able Archer 83 was different. It included new elements specifically designed to confuse and pressure Soviet military planners, including realistic simulations of nuclear weapons being transferred to launch sites, and participation by heads of state that previous exercises had never featured. Soviet intelligence observed the exercise and became genuinely convinced that it might not be an exercise, that NATO might be using the cover of a war game to stage a real first strike, exactly the kind of thing Operation Ryan had been warning Moscow to watch for. Soviet General Secretary Yuri Andropov ordered full military divisions mobilized. Nuclear weapons were physically transported to launch sites. A fleet of Soviet bombers was scrambled carrying live nuclear warheads. Military command handed Andropov the Cheget, the Soviet nuclear briefcase. The world stood at the edge for the second time in 6 weeks, and once again, it was pulled back, not by a system, not by a protocol, not by a machine, but by a single human being making a judgment call. An American Air Force intelligence officer named Leonard Perutz, stationed in Europe, noticed that the Soviets were responding to Able Archer as if it were real. He could have escalated, raised Western alert levels in response, which would have confirmed Soviet fears and potentially triggered exactly what everyone was trying to avoid. Instead, he waited. He did nothing. He watched. The Soviets eventually stood down when they satisfied themselves the exercise was genuine. The Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board later called Perut's decision fortuitous, if ill-informed. 2 men, 2 moments, 6 weeks apart, both of them deciding that the right response to a terrifying alarm was to wait and think rather than act. The nuclear age has been kept from its worst outcome not by the systems designed to manage it, but by the instincts of individual people choosing, in the worst moments imaginable, to hesitate. The life he lived after the Soviet Union kept the incident classified until its collapse in 1991. After that, pieces of the story began to emerge in Russian newspapers. In 1998, General Votintsev published his memoirs and explicitly credited Petrov with having made the correct call on September 26, 1983. The world began to notice. Petrov, by then in his late 50s, was living alone in a modest apartment in Fryazino, a suburb of Moscow, on a small army pension. His wife had died of cancer in 1997. He had cared for her through her illness, and after she was gone, he lived quietly. He grew potatoes in a garden to supplement his food. The man who may have saved the world was growing potatoes to eat. When journalists found him and asked for interviews, he was uncomfortable with the attention. He refused to call himself a hero. In an interview for the 2014 documentary, The Man Who Saved the World, he said, "All that happened didn't matter to me. It was my job. I was simply doing my job, and I was the right person at the right time. That's all." He received the World Citizen Award in 2004, the German Media Award in 2012, the Dresden Peace Prize in 2013, which included a cash award of 25,000 euros. He was honored at the United Nations in New York. Former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said of him, "It is hard to imagine anything more devastating for humanity than all-out nuclear war, and this man may have prevented it." Petrov did not trust machines. He did not entirely trust people either. What he said he trusted least of all was a person who had become a cog in a machine, someone who had stopped thinking and started executing. He died on May 19, 2017, in his apartment in Fryazino. He was 77 years old. His death went unreported for months. It was a German friend and documentary filmmaker named Karl Schumacher who first announced it publicly in September 2017, 4 months after Petrov had died. The man who saved the world died alone in his apartment, and nobody noticed for 4 months. The question he left behind. On September 26, 2018, exactly 35 years after the incident, the United Nations posthumously awarded Stanislav Petrov the Future of Life Award, accompanied by $50,000 collected by his daughter Elena. His son Dmitry had missed the ceremony. The United States Embassy had delayed his visa. He did not make his flight. That detail feels, somehow, exactly right for this story. A story full of things that almost happened and didn't, of decisions made in seconds that shaped decades, of a world that came within one phone call of ending and then continued exactly as if nothing had occurred. September 26th is now quietly observed in some online communities as Stanislav Petrov Day. The blogger and philosopher Eliezer Yudkowsky, who helped bring the story to wider attention, wrote simply, "Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, take a minute to not destroy the world." Petrov never knew how close it really was. He suspected, he knew what he knew, but the full picture of how taut the world was that night, the Cal 007 crisis, the Able Archer exercise 11 days later, the Soviet leadership genuinely expecting a first strike, became clear to historians only over many years of declassified documents and retired generals who finally felt free to speak. What he said in his last years was this: he did not trust machines. He did not trust systems. He trusted a person's ability to think, but only if that person hadn't been trained out of thinking, only if they hadn't become a cog. The question his story leaves behind is not whether he was right that night. He was. The question is, how many times has civilization survived because some anonymous, unremarkable human being in the middle of a night shift somewhere decided to think for themselves instead of following the protocol, and we simply never found out? And how many times did they not?